everybody, welcome back. We're going to start the modules for, or we're going to start the lectures for module 2. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get to that PowerPoint. All right. So we're going to talk about the Science of Sociology chapter for Soc 205. So in the early years when they did and studied sexuality, it was really talking about the study of sex. Well, before we even had a study of sex in sexology, even before that, really every way that we defined sexuality or talked about it or discussed it, which was rare because it wasn't really, it was kind of a taboo topic to talk about because it was really through the age of religion. And through that, you had things like if women desired these things or expressed outwardly their sexuality, they were considered hysterical. There was a lot of cause and effect ideas that they had about sex that were more tied to spirituality and religion than were necessarily tied to biological function and or pleasure and or desire. So really religion paved the way through really when science really started coming around, paved the way through how almost all subjects were studied. You talk about this in astronomy, you talk about this in mathematics, you talk about this in a lot of other subjects where really everything was done through the gaze of religion for a good while. And that's in almost all the cultures that started really recording their ideologies. They also recorded how they viewed the world through those ideologies. And that makes sense. Moving towards the study of sex, this really started in the age of sexology, and it was really talking about how it was biological and it was for the purposes of reproduction. This was really to hammer in that idea of that biological determinism, and we really were not looking past that. But this age also showed us that sexuality was something that could be studied and that there was ways to do that. You had Krafft-Ebing's 4 categories of sexual deviation. And he really talked about homosexuality, fetishism, sadism, and masochism. And again, we've got long past this. So this stuff that we're going to talk about now has been really debunked and really thought through, and it just has not stood the test of time. But it shows that there were people studying this at earlier points in our history. And that's something that got us to the studies that we have now that we find more valid and are much more able to stand the test of time, really. Okay. You also have Ellis, who was the first to say that homosexuality was not bad and that sexual gratification was a basic need. This was kind of a turning point, right? And again, with every turning point, you have pushback. And so again, he had some ideas that were well past his time. And unfortunately, that gave him a lot of pushback. And while this is an incredibly important person when it comes to the study of sexuality, at his point when he was really having these conversations, there was a lot of backlash to this. And then you have Hirschchild, which worked to eradicate homophobic rhetoric and published the first long-term studies of sexuality or sexual variation. And this, he had his own institute. It was actually really, really popular. He was a German. And this was kind of like the best of the best. This was who you'd want to work with if this is what you were studying at this point in time. He was known pretty much worldwide, and he had the most vast collection of really research on the subject that there was. And unfortunately, a lot of that was lost because his institute was burnt to the ground by Nazis because he was gay in the era of mass extinguishing queer people during the Nazi reign in Germany. However, there is a good portion of his data that did manage to survive that, and he also influenced a lot of researchers past the point of that, because a lot of people went over and studied with him, and a lot of people ended up getting to figure out his methods and figure out how to study this in a way that was inclusive past that point. Now we're going to get into a couple of those scholars that when you think about sexuality or when you think about social psychology, you just kind of can't get away from because they just are those names. We're going to start with Sigmund Freud. There's always the jokes. There's always that's a name that a lot of people, even outside of psychology, know. He saw sex as a pleasure-seeking biological drive. He was the first to talk about society as shaping sexuality, which is kind of a big deal. He said that sex was connected to unconscious desires, and then there was his stages of sexual gratification that, depending on the age of the person, even from a very young age, was focused on different parts of the body. And he really drew this back to family relations. He drew this back, which again is some of the things that you hear about. He drew these unconscious desires being related to other portions of your life, other portions of your interpersonal relationships. And he was really the first person to talk about the ways in which children experience or seek out experiences within their own body. And again, this was more driven towards self-exploration. This was not really discussing the consequences or violence that can be done to children in this particular field of study. So just for clarification. And then you move on, you also have Darwin, which most people know that name, even if they don't know exactly how it relates to this. But he had two really main points. His main point for natural selection being that people are going to pick partners that are there, right? So like you're going to have lines of people that are going to be more adapted to the environment in which they live in. They're going to thrive a little bit more. They're going to maybe have more economic security. They're going to have more social security. They're going to have more essentially ability to thrive and create offspring that thrive. And so that natural selection would then increase their odds at being able to continue on their line. And with that, he talked about sex selection being essentially that those who have already produced children are those who, again, have that ability to seem to be able to thrive within the environment that they're in, whether that comes from economic security, whether that comes from social security, whether that comes from resources that they have offered, or just the build of them as a human in general, is going to be something that within society is going to be selected by other mates, right? So he was very much breaking down sex in a very biological way, and also very much focused on reproduction. And again, going back to this idea that as human beings, when we're looking for partners, we're looking for someone who's going to reproduce, not someone that is going to fulfill any other kinds of needs. So he broke us down basically to animal instinct, which, as we know, humans have much more scope for why they pick who they pick. And even a lot of this had critique even for some animal species as well, because there are other drivers for creating a partner. And it had a hard time explaining any kind of sexual deviance. I use those terms very, very loosely, because that really just means for anyone that is outside of this very structured idea of what sexuality is, being that it is heterosexual, that it is very even aromantic, that it is very based on reproduction, that it is very monogamous, and that it is very cookie cutter, I guess. And that's just not how human beings worked, even in all of these studies. So that gets us to Kingsley. He is created a research institute that's still around. It's in Ohio, I believe, or Indiana. one of the two. It is a massive data collection for the time period. It was a vast array of information, akin to similar to Hirschchild, but in very, very different ways. He argued that sexuality was not binary, but more of a continuum, and he called that the Kinsey scale. But it lacked a representation of the whole U.S. It was really focused on middle-class, white, Midwestern Americans, because that's who he had access to at the time. And that's really what his research population was. However, it did show that consistently there were gender differences for how sexuality was experienced. And it also showed that there was differences, like especially when it came to partnership and age when sexuality starts, all of these things. But it also talked about the idea that within different parts of your life, you are looking for different sexual interactions and different kinds of sexual partners and different kinds of sex. And so that was really, really a big deal for sexuality research in general. And then you have Masters and Johnson, and this is the one that got really unethical in their research practices. And they essentially were really focused on the physiological response, such as arousal and orgasm. And so they were really looking, and by looking, I mean watching people in their sexual interactions and figuring out what created the most arousal, what created those orgasms for what people, why they did the things they did, and really what the outcome was. Now, there's some seriously unethical practices that happened within this research, but it did create the re-examination of the woman's orgasm as just a biological function to increase reproduction, and more drove it towards this idea that it was connected towards desire, and that in and of itself could be a driving force for women's sexuality. And so that was a big deal, despite their really unethical practices. But they were the first also to research sexuality in older adults. So they didn't just focus on young adults, they focused on those who were considered to not have sexuality anymore, and really were showing that STDs were spreading around these people and that these people were consistently doing these things. It also, they also had unethical practices when they talked about homosexuality or anything deriving from outside of the social norm. And really conversion therapy gets its root here because they were looking at it as a way in attempts to find a way to adequately cure it, and claimed to be able to do so through psychological therapies of sorts. Again, it was really akin to conversion therapy, and lots of shaming and lots of unethical practices. So while there was some positives that came out of this research, there was also a lot of harm done and a lot of negative consequences. So we're going to stop there for this lecture, and then I'll start again with the rest of chapter 2's lecture.